is Rima Atung, and I will be the primary contact for this application. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so the information will be available to others. It will be posted on the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission's YouTube website. I do also want to note that please, raise your hand using the raise hand feature in Teams, or speak up if you have a question at any point during this presentation. We do have a number of slides to get through this morning, and this application is a little bit different than previous RJ applications, so please jump in at any time with those questions. They're also really helpful for folks that watch the webinar later, so we appreciate any questions you have. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to just do a really quick overview of the CJC. We'll talk a little bit about the RJ Grant Program background, the guidelines, and then we'll get into the Restorative Justice Grant request for grant proposals for the 25-27 biennium. We'll do a quick walkthrough of the application on SM Apply, and then we'll open up for any questions that haven't been addressed already. So in case you're not familiar with us, the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission, or CJC, is a Salem-based agency under the executive branch. There's 7 commissioners appointed to the commission that make the decisions for CJC. The list of commissioners and their bios are available on our website if you're interested in learning more. And then supporting those commissioners, there's about a 30-person administering agency, which I myself am part of. So what we do is research projects, we develop policies, and we manage the day-to-day on these grant programs that the commissioners award funds to. And our statutory purpose is to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of state and local criminal justice systems by providing a centralized and impartial forum for statewide policy development and planning. And I think in terms of, the administering agency of CJC, that impartial forum is really important. We do try and look at data and information, and present it in an unbiased, impartial way so that decisions can be made to the best of the commissioner's ability. So let's get into a quick overview of the RJ Grant Program background. So this program was established in 2021 by HB. Oh, I must have forgotten the number there. I apologize. With an initial appropriation of $4 million, and then the program was reaffirmed in 2024 with an additional $4 million. So those have been awarded out to our existing grantees through a couple of different grant cycles. And we're offering our existing grantees a 1-quarter extension to September 30, 2025 as part of their quarterly report. I just want to point that out in case there's any current grantees on this webinar today. Make sure when you do your quarterly report, if you need that additional time to kind of buffer your program between your current contract and this potential next contract, you have the option to do that. So make sure you select that with your quarterly reporting. We do have, as part of the CJC's budget bill, HB 5005, another $4 million appropriation for this Restorative Justice Grant Program. As I'm sure most of you are familiar with how the legislative session works, that won't be confirmed on whether or not we get that $4 million until the end of the legislative session. But we do want to go ahead and move forward with the application process, since it is kind of a lengthy process, and we have grantees that we know really rely on these funds. So we're going to do a two-part process, which I'll get into a little bit more as we go through this presentation. That's going to start now, and then the budget portion will be after the confirmation of whether those funds are approved or not. So let's get into the grant program guidelines. And actually, Avery, my wonderful backup person that knows everything, did inform me that HB 2204 is the 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 bill that created this program. So I apologize again for leaving that information out of the slide. It got deleted somehow. All right, so into the grant program guidelines now. This program has administrative rules, and there's links to each of these different documents and resources in the presentation. We'll be sending out copies of it, along with, the link to the recording for this webinar, so you have that for reference. But please review the administrative rules for the agency and for the program itself. That gets into, the really important information like the eligibility criteria, what things the applicant must have to be able to be funded through this grant. We'll go through it now, but we always recommend looking at those program rules as well. Then for our administration, we do have general rules on top of those program rules for how we administer all grants, and that can be found in the grant administration guide. So please, refer to that as well. And then there's the request for grant proposals itself, and that details the specific requirements for this application cycle, because those change from biennium to biennium. So please make sure you review all of that information when you're developing your application. The RFGP grant administration guide, some of the supporting documentation we'll get into, like the internal staff scoring sheet, are available on our website on the RJ grant program page. So please refer to those. And then the application form is through SurveyMonkey Apply, and we'll have a link, or actually a link to that is included, and we'll get into what that looks like when we do our application walkthrough towards the end of this presentation. So to be eligible, you must be a public or private entity and either an established program, and you are requesting funds to build upon an existing restorative justice program, or an implementation program, and you're requesting funds to build a new program. I do want to note here that in some of our previous grant application and award cycles for this grant, the grant advisory committee for the program limited awards to only, existing programs that had already been awarded under this grant program or new programs. We don't have those restrictions currently, and these identifications as established or implementation programs are really to help us understand the answers to the questions that we're asking in this application. And you'll see kind of how it fits in when we get into the questions. So here's some further definitions for those eligible applicant types. Public entities includes any tribes or public body, like state government, local county government, special government bodies, and private entities really covers a whole gamut of different types of private entities, from corporations, trusts, to community-based organizations. And I would like to note here that you can also apply as a public and private entity together jointly. And we just got a comment, it looks like. So let me. Looks like some folks are having an issue viewing the slides. So are some people able to see the slides? Yeah, okay, I see nods. So okay. So we're getting a lot of yeses, so I'm not sure what the issue is. And I apologize, again, this recording will be posted and we'll send out a copy of the slideshow. You might try just logging off and logging back in, and see if that helps, or checking your settings on your computer, see if that helps. But the slides will be available, and so will the recording, so you can refer to them later. I don't know if it'll be beneficial for you to just sit in and listen and have questions, see if you have any questions from what you hear. You can also send us questions later, via email as well. All right, so moving on. Um, so the grant program requirements include this stipulation that the program must serve the definition of restorative justice established in the program rules. And this is really important. So again, make sure you review that. And it must be a front-end program that designed to intervene pre-conviction, pre-adjudication in the criminal justice or juvenile legal system. So there's this nice graph here that shows you all these different steps in green here are places where an RJ program under this grant could be funded. So, at the point of harm in the community, at the point of law enforcement contact, at the point where the case is referred to the prosecutor and they're making choices, or during those initial court events. Those are all points where an RJ program funded under this grant could operate, but it cannot operate on the back end, or at any point, you know, during or after conviction or adjudication. So that is really important to keep in mind when you're creating these programs. Some other requirements, and again, these are requirements that determine a program's eligibility for funding. So they're really important that you look at these and you understand them, and your program incorporates them, and you demonstrate that in your application. So the grant program requirements include centering on the experiences of those harmed, encouraging those who have caused harm to take responsibility in repair of the harm, supporting persons who have been harmed, impacted community members, responsible parties, and identifying solutions that promote healing and dialogue and mutual agreement, coordinating with community-based organizations, and an ability to work collaboratively with system partners, including but not limited to local law enforcement entities, courts, district attorneys, and defense attorneys. And I apologize, these are kind of a mouthful, so I'm stumbling a little bit on my words, but hopefully, you're able to see that and hear that. All right. They're kind of open-ended requirements. So as we get into the application on SurveyMonkey Apply, and our staff internal scoring sheet, we're going to be using for that preliminary staff review. There are some things included that kind of help quantify and specify what these things might look like in your application. This grant program also has preferences included in the rules, and these are preferences and not eligibility requirements. So these are things that the Grant Advisory Committee and the Commission consider when making awards, but they're not required for you to receive funding. So a successful program would likely incorporate all or most of these things, but again, they're not required. So the preferences include offering services that engage or serve rural or historically underserved regions, offering services that are culturally appropriate to socially disadvantaged individuals, partnering with a research entity to track and report on program outcome measures, addressing cases involving person felonies or misdemeanors, addressing case types that carry a presumptive prison sentence, prioritizing funding for direct services to the harm party and person that committed the harm, and then also not disqualifying participants based on prior criminal history. So if your program incorporates any of these components, again, those might be given preference during the award process that the grant advisory committee and the commission go through. So now we're going to get into the request for grant proposal, or RFGP itself. And let me just pause here to see if I missed any questions or comments. I don't see any. Again, please raise your hand if you have any. That's the best way to just alert me that I need to pause for a second. And I'm not, oh, it looks like we do have one. Adam?
Hi, Rima.
Hi.
Is there a preference of juvenile versus adult?
No, not at this time.
That's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Right, so here is the timeline for the RFGP. It was released on the 1st of April, so it's up on our website now. You're available to start, filling out the application. The preliminary applications, which is going to cover the narrative section of the report primarily, so the program description, client description, all of that stuff is going to be due May 13th. We have a grant advisory committee meeting set for June 16th to review those preliminary applications. And during that meeting, they're going to also, bring up any questions or concerns they have for the applicants. And we'll also be able to make, hopefully, since the legislative session will almost be closed at that point, have a definitive answer on what the budget will be. So if they have any budgeting priorities, they'll make those determinations at that time as well. That all information will be sent to everyone who completed that preliminary application. We'll open the final application, and then the final application will include an opportunity to respond to those questions and concerns, as well as upload your budget, your final budget. I do want to note that, it's best if you work on that budget ahead of time so you have a nice long window to complete it. But that does give applicants an opportunity to kind of refine their budget based on that feedback that they've gotten from the Grant Advisory Committee. The final application will be due July 22nd. Then we'll do another Grant Advisory Committee review where we look at those revisions or responses to Grant Advisory Committee member questions. We look at the budget. They make recommendations. Then we'll present those to the commission, and we'll get the responses, or excuse me, the awards out after that. And the project period is set to begin October 1st. Again, we don't know the total amount that's going to be available at this time. We're hoping that we can start dispersing funds, as close to that October 1st start date as we can. The actual applicants will have the option to retroactively start their program back July 1st, or October 1st, depending on their needs. And the project end date for this biennium will be August 30, 2027. Usually it's July 1st, but we extended it just a little bit to give our grantees a little bit of extra time to close out their program and just get those funds spent. So it's going to run until August 30th instead. As hopefully folks know by now, the project period is the time frame in which you must spend the awarded funds. So please keep that in mind when you are writing those budgets. Um, how much money should we ask for? The best answer to that question is how much funding you can justify within the grant rules and priorities. And we do look at those budgets and the justifications provided in those budgets and make sure that they align with those funding priorities and they're reasonable and appropriate. So just keep that in mind when you're developing your budget as well. And again, we won't know about funding after this grant cycle until the close of the legislative session at the earliest. The funding categories. Oh, and it looks like Adam has another question.
All right, another quick one. For those of us that this is a first time, is there a ballpark of what a normal program like this costs, what you all expect?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, I wish I had a better answer for it. But our current grantees, because of the kind of bouncing up and down of the funding that we've received so far, our planning grantees who just got awarded 6 months to do a planning project, their awards were anywhere from like $20,000 to, $700,000. And our current grantees that have had ongoing programs for, several years at this point, over like a 4-year period, have gone up to 1.9 million. So it's really, I wish I had, a range, but it's kind of been all over the place, especially since the grant project period has been extended for more than a biennium. So it just depends on what's appropriate for your program. And again, please, look to that final application instruction email that will include a little bit more information once we get that final number from the legislators.
Okay, great, thank
Yeah, sorry.
you. Okay.
All right. So the Restorative Justice Grant does support a lot of different funding categories. Really, you can apply for personnel, contractual, equipment, supplies, travel and training, rent, utilities, and administrative costs for this grant. So anything that supports your program, really. I do want to note here that for most of our grants, there's a cap on administrative costs of 10% for the Restorative Justice Grant. Since many of our applicants are community-based organizations, we were able to raise that cap to 15%. So your administrative costs just need to be 15% or below of your total ask. The grant administration guide has a more extensive list of allowable and unallowable uses of funds, but here are some just examples for you. As I said, allowable uses of funds are any program design that meets the rules, statutory requirements, and guidelines. Uh, if there are anything that you include in your budget there that are on the unallowable use list, those are absolutely not allowable. There are some costs that can be permitted with exception. So again, I advise you just to look at the grant administration guide and see what those are. However, those tend not to be approved without sufficient justification. So just, look at those, make sure you understand them, and don't include them in your budget request. So some specific examples are, staff salaries and fringe, contracts for professional services, victim survivor services, training or technical assistant services related to the grant program goals. Those are all definitely allowable. Some unallowable examples are supplanting existing funds, employee bonuses, and marketing or branding, specifically when you're preparing something for sale or to make money. um, Creating flyers or websites to convey information to the public generally is not marketing or branding. But if you are attaching a fee to it, that may not be allowable. So the application evaluation process, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but we do have, a multiple tiered review. It starts with a staff review. CJC staff look at the application for completeness, adherence to program rules, and we do employ a scoring rubric, which is included as an attachment to the request for grant proposals and also as a separate Excel document on our website. And we'll get into it a little bit more later on. But we are doing an objective, review really to see if the applicant was responsive to the questions and how much information they provided, to help us organize the applications to make a more efficient review when the grant advisory committee does their review. So when they do their review, it's a little bit different. They assess those, um, you know, they assess those eligibility requirements as well. They also look at the preferences, and they come up with concerns and questions, and they also review for making recommendations to the commission. So they're the ones that actually do that first step of the recommendation to award process. And then the commission also does their review, and they're the ones that determine what the awards are, if they want to accept those recommendations made by the grant advisory committee, and authorize awards to the applicants themselves. So every step has a different, every tier has a different step and a different authorization. So it's good to understand those. And we do tend to email out applicants and let them know where they're at in the process. So you have that, you kind of have a framework for where you are and how it's been proceeding. This application, as I mentioned, is a little different than the previous biennium's application. The preliminary application includes a cover sheet, which should look familiar to returning applicants. A program description and staffing section is next. That includes 6 questions. Then we have 6 questions on engagement and referral process for your proposed program, 5 questions on data and outcomes, 7 questions on those priorities that we saw on slide 10, I think it was. And then you'll have optional document uploads where you can include a memorandums of understanding with your partner agencies or referral agencies, letters of support, and things like that. And then, as I mentioned, in the final application, you'll have an opportunity to respond to those questions and edit your preliminary application in whatever section, whatever of those above sections the GAC had questions or concerns on, and then you'll have a chance at that point to upload your budget projection sheet as well. So let's get into the application itself. Or let me pause for a second and just see. I don't see any hands raised, but let's just wait a second and see if anyone has any questions about that stuff. And also so I can get a drink. No, all right, I'm not seeing any hands. So this is what you will see if you follow that link to the application. This is what our SurveyMonkey Apply platform looks like. And you'll have the opportunity to either log in or register. And then you click this green apply, and that will bring you into the application itself. If you've applied for restorative justice funds in the past, just make sure that you are clicking on the correct one that has the 2025 or 2025, 2027, biennium noted on there. You'll next see a page that looks like this. Once you click into the application, on the left side is kind of the guide of where you are in the application process, and you have those review and submit buttons. And then on the right side, you have the tasks, both the required tasks, which is the cover sheet, application questions, and data attestation, and then those optional uploads that I mentioned. So if we click into, well, actually, if you have somebody, if you're the primary contact for your agency's application and you want someone else to have access to log in and also work on that with you, you're going to want to pay attention to this Add Collaborator button. Click on that. It'll give you, the option to enter other email addresses, excuse me. You can choose view and edit or view only access for that person. It'll send them an invitation and then they'll create a login and they'll be able to access that application as well. So then you'll go back to that main page. So the first thing you'll want to fill out is this cover sheet. So you access it by clicking on the cover sheet link under the tasks there. It'll bring you to that page, which has, the preliminary information on the due date. And then you get just the basic questions like what kind of entity are you? Is your organization a nonprofit registered in the state of Oregon? Your legal name, and then that question about are you established or implementation? And again, this is not because there's a priority attached to either of those. It's really to help the reviewers when they're looking at answers to the questions that follow this. You'll also be filling in your primary applicant contact information and your fiscal contact information. And then make sure for all of these pages and sections, when there is a save and continue, editing, and mark as complete button on the bottom, that you do save your work. And when you're finished completing it, you mark as complete. Once you have done that, you'll see kind of a summary of all the information that you submitted. On the right-hand side, you'll see the little dots where you can actually, choose to download, reset, or edit whatever section you've completed. And it'll also show you the green check mark on the left side, which shows that that section has been completed, which is really important for those required sections. If you try to submit the final application or the preliminary application and it's not submitting, go back and check to make sure that all the sections have those green check marks. There's a link at the top left side to go back to the main application page, and that'll bring you back to this view. Again, you'll see the green check mark on the section you've completed, and then you can go into the application questions section. So we're going to go through all the questions kind of quickly. So please stop me if you want to spend a little bit more time on any of these questions. We really recommend that you read through all of the questions before you answer. And I do want to note here too that the narrative questions in these first few sections focus on how your program is designed and also those really critical eligibility criteria that you have to comply with to be able to be funded. So make sure that that information is included where appropriate. And if you have any questions about which questions kind of address different eligibility criteria, again, I would recommend you look at the staff internal scoring sheets because that outlines what information we would, or the grant advisory committee and our own, staff research has kind of put together which questions address which eligibility criteria and how they should align in your application, if that makes sense. So, the first program description and staffing addresses your program's goals and objectives, your program design, and what evidence-based practices that you're utilizing for your program model. I do want to also note here that each section has its own word limit. So please pay attention to those as well. And they kind of give you an idea of how lengthy of a response we think you might need. So the first question has a much longer limit than the second question, for example. Uh, this section also covers how your program will operate, including a description of what services will be available, what restorative practices, such as restorative dialogues, will be utilized. The next question looks at staff training that staff and restorative justice facilitators will receive, and then how many staff hours you anticipate needing for each participant case. Most of the questions are like what you see on screen, just kind of open-ended responses with a word limit. There will be some yes or no questions that branch off. If you answer either yes or no, and then a second window will open where you should provide additional little narrative. So please keep that in mind when you're filling out the application as well. If another response window opens up, please make sure to complete that too. The next question in this section is provide a timeline of when program milestones and activities are anticipated to be completed. And that's the end of that first section. The next section is on engagement and referrals. So that's what is your service area? What are your community and system referral partners, and what stage in the criminal, legal, or juvenile system do they occur? Who is eligible for services, and then, some questions about how the screening and onboarding happens for those participants, how your program will engage harm parties and what supports will be available to them, how many clients are referred to you or do you anticipate being referred to you. So this is one of those questions where the answer ties into whether you're, an existing or implementation, or excuse me, not existing or implementation, but an established or implementation program. If you're an established program, the answer to these questions should really be based on what you have seen in the past program year, like how many clients were actually referred through your doors. If you are an implementation program and you don't have that information, then we want your best guess about how many you anticipate. So that designation you choose in the cover sheet will, kind of reflect how you answer these questions. Then you get into a little bit more detail about those referrals and how many of those people referred were served by your program, how many successfully completed the program, how many are still receiving services from the program, and then how many, in the previous biennium, did you encounter any challenges or barriers that impacted the number of clients you served? And as I kind of breezed through previously, these are all questions that came from the Grant Advisory Committee, and they're really interested in your answers to. The goal is to really understand the size and scope of your program. For example, a program that targets person crimes, felonies, violent crimes may have very different goals for the number of people served, and the amount of services may be a lot higher that each individual gets than a program that serves, lower level non-person crimes. So we're really trying to get at, for the type of program that you are proposing, is your, how many clients can you reasonably see serving? How much services are they going to get? How many staff hours are going to be spent on each person? So we have a good idea of what that program model really looks like. And this question number 6, in the previous biennium, did you encounter any challenges? We've seen the programs that we have funded in the past run into some pretty significant barriers, but we haven't had a chance to really look at them across the board. So the grant advisory committee is really interested in trying to identify if there's commonalities in those barriers, and what steps folks have taken to address those barriers to better meet those enrollment goals. The next section is on program data and outcomes. So we are looking at what does successful completion look like for your program. So that's, those criminal justice outcomes that the program is focused on and the program is really designed to support, as well as some of the, whatever other successful completion goals or, outcomes you've been able to observe for your program that might, not fit into that definition, but you feel are also important to show the success of your participants, like connection to services or some of those other things. So this is a repeat of that first question. What does successful completion look like for your programs? Our clients offered support services after they graduate. What data will you collect to demonstrate your program's success? We listed out some data collection methods, but obviously more could be included. And we're really looking for programs that can gather that information to really speak to the success of their program. And then for let me apologize first. This should be question 4 at the top. Says question 3, should be question 4. For this question 4, what we're looking for here is really that data, those numbers that you have for those outcomes that you talked about in the previous question. And then question 5 here is your opportunity to provide any additional information you would like to share about your proposed program. And that is not just in relation to, the data and outcomes section, but anything you feel like wasn't addressed throughout the other application questions that came before it. The application questions that we included, like I said, are really specific to what the Grant Advisory Committee was curious about, learning about these programs, what they thought was important information to really understand the program design, those eligibility criteria, and then, just basic program, how the program functions. So if there's anything outside of that you think is important to know, please include it here. And again, we'll have the opportunity to review all of your responses to these questions, and the Grant Advisory Committee can ask additional questions if they don't feel, if they feel like they might need additional information that you didn't provide in that preliminary application. Any questions or concerns so far? All right, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit because we only have 15 minutes left. It's kind of a lot. I apologize. Again, we're open to any questions that you have during this presentation or after. Feel free to contact us. The next section really addresses those program priorities that were on slide 10. And they're much, more straightforward to answer. It's list the preference, like does your program offer services that engage in rural or other historically served regions? Answer yes or no. If you answer yes, then you provide a little bit more information. So I'm not going to read through all of those because the questions are basically just those preferences verbatim. You answer yes or no, give additional explanation. But this is just included so you can see what that section looks like. Once you've completed all those application questions, you'll be able to review them. You'll see those green check marks showing that that's completed. And then you move on to the data attestation. This is also a required section of this application. You need to make sure that you click this "I acknowledge the above" I acknowledge that if funds are awarded, our entity will collect and submit to CJC program information, including but not limited to expenditures, outcome measures, program evaluations, demographic information pertaining to eligible and enrolled participants, satisfaction metrics for both the responsible and harm parties, and data collected in partnership with a researcher or research entity. So it's very important that you read that, you acknowledge the above, you mark that as complete. Otherwise, you won't be able to submit your application. Then you have two sections for uploading those optional documents, the memorandum of understanding with any like referral partners or any other partners you might have. And then the letters of support, you just click on the attached file and mark as complete. And then you can choose to review your application at that point. So you'll see a screen like this, which just, has that uneditable summary of your whole application. You'll be able to see that it's 100% complete, that you've completed those required sections, and then you can click on the submit your application. It'll ask you to confirm whether or not you want to submit. If you hit submit, it will be submitted and you will no longer be able to edit your application. So just keep that in mind. Let me go back. Any questions about the walkthrough of the application online? All right, Adam, what's your question?
Sorry to be the only one asking questions. But how will the letter of support and MOU be factored into the scoring?
So they're not, they help us understand, for example, what your referral pathways are, what buy-in is from any partner agencies. So they kind of speak to those eligibility criteria, and they're called out in the staff internal scoring sheet that we're going to look at in a second, but they're not required. They're just, I guess, evidence that you have considered these things that we think a successful program would consider.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So with that, and Miles, looks like you have a question as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering when it comes to that question for the data and outcomes, is there specific kinds of data that you're looking for in terms of that answer?
Well, if you're an established program, just whatever data you've been collecting to show what you think is successful. So it kind of ties really well into that other question above it. What does program success look like for your program? And then we're kind of looking at what data have you been collecting. I would expect some basic statistics like number of clients that completed the program and number of clients that achieved X outcome, Y outcome, whatever you're tracking that hasn't been already addressed in those other questions that came before it. Does that help?
Yeah, I was just more curious because like for the planning phase grant
Right.
recipients like me, like we didn't do a lot. We're not doing a whole lot of direct services because we're building out. So the data that we've collected has just been on our system partners and community partners and, moving forward. So if that's the kind of data you're looking for, then yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You could, if you're at that point where you're moving from planning to implementation, you can include data that you have collected and then data that you are expecting to collect when you start
Gotcha.
implementing the program.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. So that initial staff review, as I mentioned, is going to focus on application completeness and eligibility. We have this internal scoring sheet, what's going to, sorry, it's going to help us organize the applications for review for the Grant Advisory Committee. I do want to just reiterate here, it's an analytical tool for us, not a decision-making tool. We are not making decisions. We're looking at the completeness and responsiveness the applicant has to the different questions in the application. And it also kind of highlights, we published it because the rubric really shows us trying to quantify and specify some of those eligibility criteria that are kind of vague and include the types of information that the Grant Advisory Committee has identified as important and speaking to those eligibility criteria. It's not totally inclusive. There may be things that you think are important and speak to those criteria that aren't in the spreadsheet, and please, by all means, include them. But these are ones that we have identified so far as being important. And as I mentioned before, this is just step one in the review. The Grant Advisory Committee will look at all the applications, and they have been incredibly thorough in their review previously. They'll look at all the applications, they'll come up with their questions and comments for that preliminary application, and you'll have an opportunity in your final application to respond to those questions and comments. So this is just step one, and it's an analytical tool, and it's meant to help you in seeing what we think is important. Adam?
I see the checkbox by nonprofit status.
Yep.
You mentioned before that there was a 15% admin rate for nonprofit.
It's for all applicants.
For
We
all
just increased it to 15% because nonprofits tend to, have more admin burden than maybe some other types of agencies.
Great. And so we're county government. Would
Yep.
we would not check that box?
You
Or
wouldn't,
we would say no.
you would say no, but you would still be eligible for the 15% admin cap.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. And we have 5 minutes left and about 9 slides to get through. So I'm going to go through this section pretty quickly. Again, reach out if you need to. So in the next few slides, I included a sample of some of the criteria in that staff review scoring sheet. The full sheet is available, like I said, on the CJC website. So in the first section, for example, the criteria is, does it identify programs, goals, and objectives? We can see how responsive people are. Did they include a detailed response, or did they include almost no information? And so that's kind of what we're looking at this stage. The answer identifies activities and services, including how evidence-based and restorative practices are incorporated into proposed activities and services. So it gets a little more specific than just, does your program use evidence-based practices? Yes or no. You kind of have to, a really good answer would show how it does in your program design. Oh, and thank you. Thanks for all your questions, Adam. This second example shows how the eligibility requirements are incorporated. So, for example, in this engagement and referral section of the questions of that preliminary application, the question asks about what the referral sources are and what stage in the criminal or juvenile legal system the referrals occur. This question really speaks to several different eligibility requirements. So your answer ideally should respond to each of those eligibility requirements. So we've highlighted that in the rubric, so you know that, okay, question 2 in this section, I should include information about, my program is definitely pre-adjudication. It has to be pre-adjudication to be eligible, so I'm going to mention that in this section. It also must demonstrate coordination with community-based organizations. So you're going to want to include that in your response because that's where we will be looking for that information. And then for kind of additional reference, we do include where it says, you know, in the parentheses at the end of these bolded statements, scoring, see eligibility requirements detail. If you want a little more information on what compliance with that eligibility requirement, what meeting that eligibility requirement might look like, scroll down in the Excel form to the eligibility requirements detail, and it'll go through each eligibility requirement one by one and outline, again, not necessarily every factor that might show a program complies with that eligibility criteria, but kind of some factors that you can look at and you might want to demonstrate in your response that speak to that eligibility criteria. For example, the first criteria is centers the experience of those harmed and supports those harmed in identifying solutions that promote healing. So some ways that you can demonstrate that in your response, show that that exists in your program model, is that your answer describes the use of trauma-informed practices when engaging and communicating with the person harmed, or your answer describes programs' ongoing efforts to keep victim survivor organizations engaged and informed and allows avenues for feedback. So those are some kind of related practices that have been identified as supporting that, of really demonstrating that the applicant program is really making those eligibility criteria operational, if that makes sense. Any questions at this point? Okay. So again, we're not going through all of them. There are a lot more details in that internal staff scoring rubric. Please review that before you organize your responses to those questions. The final application questions are pretty simple. They're just, would you like to edit any of the responses to the preliminary application? So all those questions that you've already filled out that have already been reviewed by the GAC, you might want to update that information because your plans have changed or because the Grant Advisory Committee recommended to change. Please be sure to include that rationale in your response if possible. And then you'll have the opportunity to upload your budget projection sheet as well. And we're right at 11. So I'll just breeze through these really quickly. So this is what the budget projection sheet will look like. This part won't be open until the final application is opened. There's also a timeline. We looked at it already, but this is just to reiterate the preliminary applications due May 13th. The final application is going to be due July 22nd. So we have a little bit of time to get through the full application process. Things to remember, please look at the word limits, be focused and direct in your answers. Check those resources that we provided. We can answer some types of questions, but not others. We can answer how program rules apply, what the requirement means. If you have questions about the content of the RFGP, or if you're having difficulty with the online application system, we can't answer other types of questions like if the response is good, or providing you feedback on a detailed basis. Here's my contact information and the contact information for Avery. Please reach out if you have questions. Also, if you are not on the interested parties list, you can email us and get an answer to that, or sorry, join that list as well. We send out announcements about other funding opportunities through that list. Any additional questions before we close out? We're a couple minutes over, so I appreciate you guys all for sticking with me. Any additional questions at the moment? No? All right, well, we're going to go ahead and close out this webinar. As I said, we'll post it on the CJC website. We'll send out the slides to all the participants. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to receiving your applications.